professional psychology in Chicago. I'm the executive director of an institute here called the Institute on Public Safety and Social Justice. We do a lot of work that's around creating, really trying to meet public safety challenges with socially just solutions, right? And so most people don't think of public safety in that way, but one of the real underlying themes of public safety challenges is childhood trauma. And so hopefully you'll see what I mean in my presentation. So people can respond if you want in text, and I can read through. In this picture, what are the things that you see and feel when you see this picture? Beyond a brick wall, most people see in black. Somebody just said gang activity, right? Some people respond to the clothes, the graffiti, the gun, the facelessness, ghetto, what somebody just said, right? How do you feel when you see it? What's the feeling behind it? Fear, unsafe, scared. It's definitely a scary feeling. It's not something you want to walk toward. And this is the real crux of what we want to talk about. Scared. I mean, all of these things make sense. I don't walk toward hooded figures with guns either. They kind of look like the Dementors and the Harry Potter thing. I mean, it's a scary, little bit of a scary picture. So let's go to the next. So what's wrong? And how can it be made right? And I think that that's an important question because it's really at the nexus of what we've really done in this country. Like, what has our answer been around what is wrong with this picture? Well, lots of us feel scared or uneasy or see gang activity and things that we don't really feel positively about. It's hard to figure out how to really make it right. And what we've invested in more than any other intervention is a criminal justice intervention. And in the U.S., you can see this is a slide around juvenile incarceration rate for 100,000 youth in lots of different countries. And it's just off the chart in the U.S. I mean, look at it compared to every other country. Every other country invests its public safety dollars in other ways. We invest our public safety dollars in incarceration, detention, criminalization. And what's interesting about that investment is that we don't get a positive return on our investment. There is no greater predictor for being imprisoned as an adult than being detained as a young person. And so juvenile incarceration means all sorts of bad things like worse grades and more criminality in the future. There's really like not a lot of positives that come from incarcerating people, but the real thing on our minds is that it's going to make the public safe. So this one study that was done that really looked at hundreds of the young people that were incarcerated found that those that are incarcerated as juveniles are 13 to 39% less likely to graduate from high school than those charged but not convicted of the same crime. So the reason why there's that range, 13 to 39, is because of various controls. Like the absolute most conservative figure would be 13, but what they found would be the more of an average figure is the 39%. So what this means is that two people jack a car, right? They try to steal a car. One of them gets caught and gets locked up. The other one never gets caught or goes to court but isn't convicted. And then guess what? As the ones that aren't convicted are the ones who are more likely to graduate from high school, right? And so juveniles that are incarcerated are 22 to 41% more likely to have entered adult prison by age 25 compared with other public school students from the same neighborhood. So that's a little different comparison group. I talked about this, that juvenile detention is like throwing good money after bad, because the U.S. incarcerates juveniles at a much higher rate than other nations, and it spends $6 billion per year on juvenile corrections. if you think about like what we could do with that amount of investment in young people that provided positive return on our investment, that may be what we want to start thinking about. Because on any given day, there are over 70,000 juveniles in custody in the U.S., with an average direct cost of about $88,000 per juvenile per year. You could be sending each one of them to Harvard, right? You could get some tutoring, maybe some housing. I mean, there's a lot you could do with $88,000 per kid. I'm sure each of you would like $88,000 per year in scholarships and living expenses. So how does 88,000 compare with other kinds of expenditures on youth development? I mean, mostly the largest kind of investment we make in youth as a nation is in education, right? And so $88,000 per year versus an average on tuition fees at a public university would be about $7,600, or if you want to throw in room and board. I think that this is not out-of-state tuition, because if it were out-of-state or private tuition, it might be $40,000 on living expenses and out-of-state tuition. And so still an incredible savings from what we are paying to lock up young people. Then we think like, okay, so if this doesn't work, what do young people really need? They need love. They need education, protection, recognition, rites of passage. They want to feel useful. They want to build their skills. They need adults to invest in them, kind of help them to realize their full potential. And this is a quote from an article that I wrote, that if we do not adequately educate, support, and protect our children, they will continue to arm themselves. Those that are systematically marginalized lose hope and do not expect to be protected by mainstream structures such as the police or school personnel. Whenever I talk to young people in juvenile detention, I always say, why do you carry a gun? And they always say two words, and they are the same two words faithfully, and it is for protection. They want to feel protected. And who's responsible for providing safe communities, safe schools, safe environment for young people to be in? It's adults, right? And so it's incumbent upon us to really think and build systems and ways of working with young people that do not drive them to arm themselves, but instead start to fulfill the list of things that we all need as human beings in order to grow to be successful pro-social adults, and that's the list on the left. So hurt people, right? And the idea of talking about kind of a paradigmatic shift from leaning on criminal justice system to thinking about how we really can think about public safety in a more socially just way. So suppression, isolation, shame, denial of access to education and treatment only serve to make problems worse. Or lack of access to justice. I mean, lots and lots of young people are entangled in the justice system that doesn't adequately, that's not adequately equipped to really represent them in a way that's protective of their civil liberties or their positive adult development. So we can improve public safety by strengthening families and in a way that calls for a different approach and understands trauma, right? So we really need to think about how trauma fits into the mix. And that whole thing about being more trauma-informed is shifting the perspective. It's like, instead of asking the question, what's wrong with you? It's about asking the question, what happened and how can I help? These are two very, very different questions, but you'll see that young people that enter systems of, like, even young people that say get sent to the principal's office because they're disrupted in class. For young people that are privileged in schools with more resources, they may get a really different perspective in terms of, hey, it's not like you, what's going on? That's a restorative response that maybe they get sent to the social worker's office, or, you know, that some sort of intervention may happen for them in order to stay in good graces with the school and be reintegrated into their class with minimal disruption. Whereas other ways that we treat young people can be criminalizing them by booking them in the police room that they have, like all Chicago public schools, high schools, have police rooms that are right on campus. They don't even have to go outside of the school to be arrested. And that's very much a trauma-inducing response and a criminalizing response. And that's where the school to prison pipeline begins, with this whole thing about what's wrong with you instead of what happened and how can I help. So trauma challenges growth, right? And there's all sorts of trauma that we can see. There's interpersonal violence that is witnessing, perpetrating, and fearing violence, and this affects neural development, social development, all kinds of development for young people that are around violence, who are targets of violence. Then there's structural violence, like the lack of access to high quality education, employment, nutrition, or justice, and we'll talk about that. There's ACEs. Definitely let me know if you've heard about ACEs. I have a few slides on that. That's adverse childhood experiences, and that's something that's really fueling a lot of great work in and around Drexel, and also creating this drive for Philadelphia specifically to be the first trauma-informed city in the country. So I can talk a little bit about that. And then historical trauma. So why don't I start breaking down what some of these different kinds of traumas are. So what's the ACEs study? I'm going to start there. It's basically a longitudinal study that was started by two medical doctors named Rob Anda and Vince Folletti. We're on this first name basis, Rob and Vince. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, they're really interesting speakers, and they did this great study. There's over 17,000 patients that were chosen from Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. The study was done in partnership with the CDC. And what they asked was 10 questions of all of these adults, right? And they asked them what kinds of adverse childhood experiences they had suffered before the age of 18. And they only asked about 10 categories of harm. So the categories of abuse were if they asked whether or not they had suffered, and they didn't ask in these terms, but they asked in very plain-spoken questions. If they had suffered psychological abuse at the hands of their parents, if they had suffered physical abuse at the hands of their parents, and just to give you a sense of what the questionnaire looks like, you can find it very easily online. It's a 10 or 11 question questionnaire, and it says stuff like, before the age of 18, did your parents ever hit, slap, kick, or beat you? Like, it's very broken down into plain English. They asked if people had endured sexual abuse by anyone, if they had endured emotional or physical neglect. And then they asked about 5 categories of household dysfunction. And those include being raised in a home where there's substance abuse, whether they lost a biological parent through divorce or through death, if they had been raised in a home where their caretaker is mentally ill, and including ongoing depression, if they had witnessed their mother being treated violently, and if they had any criminality in their family home to the extent that someone in their home was incarcerated. And you can see by these percentages on the slide that every single category is fairly common, right? And so, especially almost a quarter of the people said that they were physically abused, a little over 1 in 4. But then what's also interesting is for sexual abuse, it's 28% of women responded that they had been sexually abused, and 16% of men, an average of 22% of everybody total. So that was just a phenomenal number of people who were admitting to having been sexually abused before the age of 18. Because, I mean, there would be a demand characteristic to not answer that, to underestimate the number of people who would answer that honestly, because it is a taboo subject, right? So all of these could be considered slight underestimations for the population. But in a startling way, and you can kind of go through and see what the figures are, in a startling way, what they found is globally, like most people have at least one category of adverse childhood experiences. And they kind of travel in clusters. Because if one bad thing is happening to you as a young person, the odds are that you have a number of things that are going on at the same time. Like if you see your mom getting abused at home, chances are that there also may be substance abuse or that you yourself are abused and neglected. And so these are some of the ways that you'll see ACEs cluster like this. And interestingly, women are 50% more likely to have a score of greater than 5 than men are, and it may be an effect of women are more likely to report, or it could be that women are more often victimized than, that girls are more often victimized than boys. I'm not sure why it is, but I think it's an interesting finding, particularly when you see what health disparities are created when you have those high elevations of greater than 4 adverse childhood experiences. So here's the conceptual framework of adverse childhood experiences. That, the list that I showed you before of of these 10 things, what you'll see is that if anybody endorses 6 of these 10, that on average, people with 6 ACEs die 20 years sooner than people with 0, right? And so here's how the whole logic model goes. You go from being born into a situation, so this moves from bottom to top, which is, I'll talk about historical trauma, but there's like a real context of being born into historical trauma, and then you experience adverse childhood events like, you know, your mother got into a car accident and died, or you failed the 3rd grade, or you grew up with a substance abusing parent. I mean, like lots of different kinds of bad things happen to young people all the time, right? But what happens is when there's a lot of stress that builds up and up and up, then you start seeing the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment that happen as a result of people trying to cope with what's going on. So then these coping strategies are sometimes very negative, and people tend to, with high ACEs, tend to drink more, smoke more, gamble more, have sex with more partners, or have riskier behavior than people with fewer adverse childhood experiences. And so this adoption of health risk behaviors leads to disease, disability, and social problems, which then result in the early death that I was talking about before. If there are any questions about this particular model, please feel free to chime in the chat or at the end, whichever way you feel most comfortable. But I'm happy to explain anything. Since I can't read your faces, it's like I want to make sure that I'm helping you out as we go along. So here's an average. Washington State is the state that's done the most with the ACEs study. They're just about probably 10 or 15 years beyond any other state. They've been phenomenal in the way that they've used this data. And this is the average Washington classroom, right? So there's 30 students. And what's interesting is you can even think back to your own classroom experiences when you were growing up, and you can think about what the classes look like. Like, where there were people that were definitely more troubled. Those would be the people that have the higher ACEs. There are people that could have been like cutting, or that could have been like acting out, or could have been withdrawing in a way that was concerning. And then there's people that seemed like really annoyed and didn't understand why they couldn't keep it together, right? So there's lots of people. There's about, in an average classroom, there's about 6 people with no aces, about 5 students with 1 ace, 6 students with 2 aces, 3 students with 3 aces, and 7, like, so I think altogether there's like 7 students with 4 or 5 and 3 students with 6 or more aces, right? And so when there are students with no exposure to physical abuse or adult violence, their worldview is very different and their trauma triggers are going to be very different than those young people that have very elevated exposure to violence and dysfunction. And you'll see it here in this slide, like aces and suicide attempts. Like this is over a lifetime how many people commit suicide. For people that have 4 or more aces, I mean it's incredibly troubling because you see the percentage of people that attempt suicide almost exponentially increase with every ace. So the bottom axis really shows you how many aces. It goes from 0 aces all the way up to 4, and it's like basically almost 1 in 5 people with 4 or more aces attempt suicide at some time in their life. And this is a really huge issue because people don't understand how many suicides we have in this country. Like, homicide is really on our minds, particularly in cities where violence is prevalent. I know in Chicago it is. And obviously Philadelphia, Detroit, New Orleans, I mean there's lots of other cities where violence has really plagued neighborhoods, right, and livelihoods. And there's about 20,000 homicides per year, but in the U.S. there's 30,000 suicides per year. So you can see that there's a huge, huge impact that's happening with people who have been exposed to trauma in their lives, both with suicide and homicide. With people that have elevated ACEs, over 50% of women who have 4 or more ACEs say that they experience chronic depression, and so about 30% of men. And then you'll start seeing these widespread kind of health gaps. So if you have high ACEs, you're about 3 times more likely to be a current smoker, about twice as likely to have diabetes, about twice as likely to have cardiovascular disease, and 5 times more likely to have HIV than somebody who has 0 ACEs. So you can see there's such a huge spread in terms of how adverse childhood experiences affect people's health. And this is mental health too. So you're 4 times more likely to have experienced at least half of your days as being so dogged by mental health issues that you didn't feel functional. You are a few times more likely to have sought treatment for mental health conditions, to have missed work, or to require special equipment like, oxygen tanks and wheelchairs and things like that. So we're thinking about young people, right? And young people that have been court-involved young people are pretty blanketly exposed to complex trauma, right? So there's lots of things that can shape the developing brain. There's the trauma exposure, including adverse childhood experiences. But on the positive side, there's also resiliency factors. Because lots of people go through a lot of things, but it's really people that have great networks of support or, lots of things that kind of help buoy them up that help them keep going, right? Genetics can be in your favor or against you. And exposure to historical trauma, systematic marginalization are huge in terms of contributing to neurodevelopment. And so each of us has kind of a different combination of inputs that shape our perception, our cognitive ability and functioning, as well as the way that we react or interact with the world around us. Because based on our wiring, which is based on the inputs, we react differently, right, to different things. So epigenetics is a growing field, and I think it's so important, particularly when you think about court-involved or very marginalized youth. Here's an idea. Here's just one idea of telomeres. Telomeres are these little end caps that are kind of like shoelace, you know, the little plastic thing that comes at the end of the shoelace, and they prevent DNA from unraveling. But what is interesting is they find that when people have been exposed to a lot of trauma, whether it be systemic, like being kicked out of school, or in your home, like witnessing your mother getting beat up, people that have been through lots and lots of all different kinds of trauma end up with shorter telomeres. Like those telomeres, they start to fray, and they're not as able to keep to hold the integrity of your DNA intact. So this is like some really interesting genetic information that we're getting about how your lived experience can actually degrade your health in terms of risk of heart disease, obesity, cognitive decline, diabetes, mental illness, and poor health outcomes. And this completely maps onto the criminalization of youth as well. The kinds of stressors that young people have are these kinds of things that provide those types of stresses and strains and difficulties that really tax genetic integrity and that are protective of us health-wise. So here's an example of extreme neglect, right? So this is from a doctor named Bruce Perry who studies trauma in children. The left picture is a normal, normally developing 3-year-old, and the one on the right is a child who has experienced extreme neglect. And it looks, well, the one on the right always looks like a sad panda to me. You can see that. I don't know how I see that. But anyway, it's just the whole mass of the brain is so different in people's lived experiences. You start to understand we're like a constantly growing and developing organism, and that really influences everything about who we are. So we need to be careful about what we're putting our young people through to really try to promote the best possible brain development at every stage of development. So this slide shows brain development and sensitivity at different times. Like, for example, people are starting to, that study neurobiology, are starting to look at these stereotypical injuries at different parts of the brain. Like, for example, if you say, wow, there's really a lot of damage to the corpus callosum, for example. Well, that could be indicative of neglect in infancy or sexual abuse, particularly at the age of 9 or 10. And that would show itself in these stereotypical ways of reducing integration between hemispheres of the brain, or inhibiting language development, mathematical ability, or even being able to process social cues such as reading facial expressions accurately. And so it's so interesting when we're kind of looking at what are these kinds of brain injuries that are showing up in PET scans and different neurobiological testing that shows these sensitivities in different parts of the brain and in different parts of our functioning. So I'm going to say one other thing. In young people, the frontal lobe is not well developed. That center for judgment and higher order thinking doesn't really fully develop until age 25. But there is a 911 center called the amygdala. That's like your threat, harm, like fight or flight. So there's a little almond structure you see where those kids are fighting that'll say, like, you know, what do I do? Do I freeze? Do I run away? What do I do, right? And that's your amygdala, like flashing, you know, like a flashing light inside your brain. But it goes through your hippocampus. The hippocampus is your memory lane, and that kind of mediates that and tells you what's the kind of nature of that. So say you're walking across the street, and when you're walking across the street, a car comes around the corner and you think it's going to hit you. Your amygdala is going to be like, oh my God, what do I do? Do I freeze? Do I run? What do I do, right? But your hippocampus may be able to, like, you hear the screeching of the brakes, you see them pull to the side, you feel like, okay, I'm going to calm down, and then your prefrontal cortex will be able to take over from your hippocampus, which is your rational thought, and it will help you to just calm down and to start walking smoothly again, right? But for people who have experienced lots of trauma, like what involves you, the amygdala is very, very quick to heat up and very, very slow to cool down. So you get this hothead effect because these are young people who are served by maintaining their vigilance. So if you live in a hostile environment or if you're exposed to violence where you may have to either run away or fight, it serves you to be very vigilant or defensive about your environment. And so the amygdala will keep giving you this trauma response, and the hippocampus will give you this sense of like urgency, like, oh my gosh, if you don't run, that car is going to hit you, that car is going to run you down, and it creates an irrational feedback loop between the hippocampus and the amygdala that keep going around and around and around in a circle that don't get to the prefrontal cortex where you can do some higher order thinking and calm down. And so that's the way that people continue to kind of get revved up and don't, and then do kind of, what seem to be irrational or overblown things based on what seem like small provocations or triggers. One of the things that you may want to know is if you can get a copy of the slides, and I made sure that all of these slides will be made available to you, so that will happen for you guys. So don't worry if you're taking notes or whatever. You can just enjoy the show and not worry. But I definitely will make all these available. So I also want to talk about historical trauma. Historical trauma is huge, and people don't talk about it enough. In our nation's history, we have lots and lots of examples of different kinds of historical trauma. We can think about anything that has caused a loss of homeland, way of life, access to housing, language, culture, ability to practice your faith, access to freedom, right to raise your own children, or access to justice. And you can think about like Japanese internment camps, for example, and there's lots of examples, huge examples of ways of moving all Native Americans to reservations and taking their children away to be schooled outside of their communities. Are a couple of the ones that we talk about sometimes, right? There's even historical trauma when, say, for example, you live in a steel town or a logging town or in the auto industry, and then all of a sudden your entire way of life is erased and, moved somewhere else. It really leads to grief that's unresolved and unspoken. There's usually a lot of internalized depression. And when you go through something like that, when you feel systematically marginalized as a group or as a people, it leads to these cortisol levels, these stress hormone levels that are heightened, that contribute to a host of health disparities. And, the idea of historical trauma is a Native American one. It was started by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who's a Native American scholar, and she defined it as a collective emotional and psychological injury, both over the lifespan and across generations, resulting from a cataclysmic history that occurs as a result of genocide and other significant abuses. So, yes, you can sense this. I added something else to it, and I will tell you why. I think that historical trauma continues a legacy of systematic marginalization through current enforcement of policies, practices, and laws that recreate trauma. I think that historical trauma is not just about giving Native Americans smallpox on blankets hundreds of years ago. I think it is expressed in lots of current policies around enforcing their ongoing marginalization on their native land, as an example. So, and as we think about what is the big, the looming historical example of historical trauma in our history, we'll think about slavery. I mean, slavery is probably the one that comes to people's minds most readily. And what's interesting, though, is that there's one civilization that sold its people into slavery for the longest period of time, and that is the people that live in the country that is now called Scotland. Even before it was called Scotland, the people that lived there, the Albas and the Picts, Irish people were also involved. They sold their citizens into slavery into the Roman Empire, to the Middle East, the Caribbean, colonial America for a period of 1,000 years. Throughout the time that African slavery was happening, Scottish people and some Irish people were loading their indigent people onto boats and selling them in what may have become indentured servants, but a lot of them were just straight up slaves, where you never get your freedom, right? And what is so interesting is we don't really think about this or even know about this. And the reason why I think it's important is because we really think of it, of the legacy. I mean, definitely slavery is a tradition, it's an Anglo tradition that was enforced upon people and then enforced in largest number on African people. But we've seen it across continents and cultures. But Scottish people don't still endure the threat or the legacy of having come from a system of slavery or having served in a system of slavery. And so my thought is when we afford access to opportunity and justice, that healing can occur, right? So you don't see the same access to justice and opportunity in the African American population that following slavery that you saw for the Scottish population who were actual slaves. Here's a modern example of what I'm talking about. I think about how equality breeds wellness. So here was an example of this guy from Princeton. He was working in a mental health center in Massachusetts that served a LGBT population. He wanted to look specifically at sexual minority men, what they called sexual minority men, and depressed, coming in for doctor's visits and that sort of thing. So for a year, he collected data on this and said, yes, at a much higher rate than the general public, gay and bisexual men are engaging in need for medical services, particularly for mental health related to depression and other things like that. And so, lo and behold, he had a natural experiment because 12 months into his 2-year study, he found that gay marriage passed. And there was this statistically significant decrease in medical care visits, mental health care, and mental health costs compared to the 12 months before the law changed. So it's so interesting because even with that incomplete validation of a group of people that had been systematically marginalized or invalidated legally, once that validation came and they moved toward marriage equality within the state, there was this tremendous amount of psychological healing and this bounce-up effect that happened very, very quickly. So knowing all that we do about the effects of trauma and how important it is to provide people with opportunity and care, is it ethical to incarcerate children? Maybe you can weigh in on that. I'll give you guys a minute. What do you think? Is it ever unethical to incarcerate children? And by children, I mean People under the age of 18. I wish this had like a really easy like thumbs up, thumbs down, something that people could respond to quickly. Um, Under the age of 18, I said. So maybe if we did incarceration differently, depends. So what's very interesting is the idea about um, this. I love this response. I think it depends on our home environment, social support, and prognosis for rehabilitation. Um, it's so interesting because what happens, especially in law enforcement, is that you'll see that young people for whom officers have hope, they will choose to give them station adjustments rather than taking them in. So even though detention is seen as generally blanketly negative, particularly for small offenses, people will continue to criminalize them. Hold on, there's a lot of noise on my side. I'm just going to close the door. Sorry about that. So I think it's interesting because at what point do we think, well, if we see that criminalization or detention, imprisonment reduces their chances of becoming functional adults, what other kind of thing could we invest in that would be more healing? Because if we only allow people to go back to community who have great support systems, that's going to be a minority of people that are involved in the criminal justice system and that have gone that far. Because there's all sorts of kind of outs beforehand. Like, if you look at the county that I live in, over 50% of the kids that live here are white. But if you look at who's in juvenile detention, it's 86 or 87% African American, and basically the balance are Latino. There's almost more white kids. You could pretty much count the number of white kids on one hand. And there's this kind of, if you look at what happens with the white kids, their prognosis for living in the community is much better. Their prognosis for being involved in the criminal justice system later on is less than those of the kids that were incarcerated. And they get station adjustments at a much greater rate. So it's interesting because it's work to really think about how do we truly heal people that don't have a lot of resources. We'll talk about improving schools and helping families. I think this is the good news, that there is a falling rate for young people that are being locked up, and part of it may be that there's less money to lock young people up, but there is somewhat of a trend to lock up fewer young people. So here's where we are, right? What's wrong and how should it be made right if that's not what's going to happen? If incarceration is not, in terms of kind of developmentally, an easy answer in terms of what creates functional, contributing, pro-social, tax-paying adults, then how do we do that? How do we foster that change? So there's this whole idea about resilience, right? And it's important to think about what fosters resilience. A lot of us are incredibly privileged because there are things that we take for granted. And when you look at kids that are in dire circumstances, there's kind of three rules of how to, like, kind of the cornerstone for increasing resilience. One of them is having a trustworthy person you can talk to about your true situation and feelings. There are many people that feel like they don't have somebody like that in their lives. The second one is the ability to reframe your life. Because even as adults, we can look back on things we did as kids or that we got in trouble for. And even though, like, you'd be like, if you hurt another kid, like, say, for example, I went, I stole some money out of my mom's purse and tried to buy alcohol with it or something when I was 14 years old. I might think, like, if somebody else did that, I'd kind of be like, that's what kids do. I definitely did something like that. I might hold like an enormous amount of shame or feeling that I was wrong or sicker than I actually was. Because developmentally, it's kind of a normal thing for young people to do, particularly young people in distress. And so, and part of that is just about brain development, that you end up kind of placing more emphasis on emotional information like that as a young person, and it still stays filed like that even as an adult. And so it's really important to be able to reframe your life around things that you didn't really, that you should forgive yourself for, or that you didn't have any responsibility in. Like, as a 9-year-old, I was not responsible for my parents' drinking behavior. One of the ones that's most common is sexual abuse. There's a tremendous amount of shame and really kind of psychological disability around being victimized as a sexual abuse, by sexual abuse. And I think that, like, really being able to be more open about treatment really would kind of open this thing up in a huge way, because so many people are acting out of the abuse that they suffered because they feel too much shame to be able to talk about what's really going on. So then there's a third thing, like, if you have a trustworthy person that you can talk to about your true situation and feelings, and you have the ability to reframe your life, it's easier to have hope for your future. But lots of kids that are locked up are like 15 or 16 years old, and they feel like, I've already done too much in my life. There's nobody there for me. I don't have any hope. And that's incredibly sad, because we mostly think, oh, you're young. You have the whole world in your hand. You can make all these choices. It's not too late. But the most damning thing about their situation is their complete lack of hope or vision for what the future can hold. But there's other possible things, too, that have shown real help and support in terms of building young people up to be more functional contributors that are realizing their own potential. And some of these, intelligence sometimes mediates it, but there's also talent and skill mastery. There's access to creative expression, physical activity, and positive human touch. I think the human touch thing is very important to think about, because for many very highly traumatized young people, touch has really meant two things in their lives only. It means either violent threats, or it's sexualized, or it could be a combination of those two things. But biologically, we need, like, supportive, positive human touch. We need a pat on the back. We need a little fist bump. We need a hug. There's all these things that are these beautiful ways that we connect as human beings that are incredibly healing. And for very highly traumatized people, there's this whole, like, you can't touch them because it'll be either sexualized or seen as a threat. And I think that it's very, very important to reintegrate kind of a safe, shaking hands, pat on the back, arm around the shoulder, that are really helping to lift up people in lots of, like, basic human ways. And that's one trauma-informed thing that I think we just kind of overlook. There's lots of healing communities that are coming up that I think are great examples of what we can do instead of incarceration, that present positive alternatives for healing for families and communities and for young people. And the real cornerstone of these are like this list, right? They promote positive connection without fail. They promote interreliance. so that it's not just about presenting something to young people. There's like really a give and take, a back and forth. People interdepend on each other. Everybody contributes. There's healthy boundaries that are exercised and that are overtly discussed, which leads to a sense of emotional safety. There's a focus on healing and well-being. There's rhythm and ritual. Now, neurobiologically, there's lots of data that's coming up on the importance of rhythm and ritual in our lives. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it now, but I think that that's incredibly important, the kind of rhythm that your work with young people takes and can be incredibly healing. And then inclusion, like feeling like you are included, is really important, right? So restorative justice gives an opportunity to see this, and I think that that's a philosophy and a collection of practices that emphasizes the need to repair harm done to individuals and communities, right? And it helps to transform people to really help restore them to their highest form of functioning. And I like to think about restorative justice as basically what we want for our own kids. We want them to be accountable. We want them to be able to get back into the fold. We want them to repair harm that they've done, but we also don't want them to be punished forever, right? And so we want them to understand what you have to do in order to make it right, to live in harmony with others. There's lots of restorative justice that's done in schools and communities. There's some examples here. I'm going to go over them because I want to get to this. Sometimes people think restorative justice is just for very lightweight offenses, like forgetting to wear your, I don't know, like for graffiti on the wall or throwing a baseball through a window. But actually, restorative justice results in some of the greatest satisfaction for people who have been harmed and for people who cause harm. I don't think that there's any other kind of intervention or process that has been as successful in helping people find peace after such serious offenses as murder or rape or like things that we consider like incredibly harmful offenses. So here's an example out of Rwanda, because after the genocide there in 1994, this came from a photo essay in the New York Times. They didn't have the government of Rwanda didn't have money to try everybody as a criminal and throw 1 million people in jail. They just didn't, and so they turned to a restorative process, truth and reconciliation hearings. And here's a beautiful quote from this woman, Vivienne, who said, "He killed my father and 3 brothers. He did these things with other people, but he came alone to me and asked for pardon. He and a group of other offenders who had been in prison helped me build a house with a covered roof. I was afraid of him, and now I have granted him pardon. Things have become normal, and in my mind, I feel clear." These are the same types of quotes that people get after participating in restorative processes in the U.S. as well. But it's very powerful, right? And from a Drexel example, Dr. Sandra Bloom has created the sanctuary model that is in different organizations. And there are 7 sanctuary commitments that create trauma-sensitive spaces. These are kind of the philosophical undergirding that there's lots of practices that are based on these, but she's amazing, and if you could take a class with her, you should, right? So these are the 7 sanctuary commitments: social learning, democracy, open communication, nonviolence, emotional intelligence, growth and change, and social responsibility. I went to a non-secure detention facility in the Bronx for boys, and it was just had an open door. It wasn't like, there weren't bars or anything. And what was so great was to see this played out, and they had hundreds of boys there who had been there over the course of the 5 years that it had been practicing the sanctuary model. And in that time, where they had probably 1,000 boys in and out of their facility, only 5 boys had ever run away, gone to school and hadn't come back. 2 of them were brothers who were trying to find a relative. I don't know who the third one was, but I just think that it's so amazing that we can do things in a different way when we make a commitment to really positive human development any types of like healing philosophical commitments that change the way we interact and that really show a sense that we belong to each other. There's also the self model of Dr. John Rich and Ted Corbin. Sandra Bloom also did this out of Drexel, right? So I don't know how many of you have seen this, but you should check them out. They're amazing. I'm actually doing the self model at the Danville prison. It's amazing, and it really does wonderful things for people who've gone through lots of trauma and are court involved. So I think that is my last question. There's also, I put in pictures of these little cute animals because apparently it's supposed to help you heal as well. Looking at baby animals is supposed to like help soothe you and calm your amygdala. So I thought that I would end with that. And if you have more questions, that would be great. There's lots of chatting, and I'm wondering if people have questions. I want to read James. What are you doing? Yeah, I agree that we've given given what we know about children, detention may not be the best option, but I'd also caution that given how society is a palatable alternative. I think it might also depend upon the age. The younger child gets involved with the juvenile system, the worse the future prognosis may be. I think the best way. Where is this? Can people read this? I think we're at the end of our time.
Elena, thank you so much for all of this amazing information. If people have more questions or anything like that, your email.
Restorative justice hubs, which are alternatives to detention in Chicago, and basically we're starting to get judges to like basically divert youth from court to community, and so far working quite well. So it might be easier than you would imagine.
Awesome. So yes, please feel free to email Dr. Quintana questions, and thank you so much, Elena, for your time. Perfect. So I just want to say that the next webinar we're going to have is on Tuesday, November 11th. It is at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so 9 a.m. Pacific Time, and Dr. Jay Singh is going to be presenting, and the title is called Nailing the Interview, Answering Your Most Feared Questions and Getting the Position of Your Dreams. So if anyone's interested in that, definitely tune in. We'll send reminders. And this webinar will also be up on the APOS students page within the next few days. So definitely take a look for that. So thank you so much.